It was 1995, and Paul Graham was sitting in front of a computer screen in a cramped apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was 30 years old, had a PhD in computer science from Harvard, and was supposed to be an academic. But something else kept pulling at him. He had just finished writing a book about a programming language called Lisp, and he was broke. The book advance was gone, and he was running out of money. He needed to figure out what to do next. That winter, he got an idea. What if you could build software that ran inside a web browser, software that businesses could use without installing anything on their computers? The web was new. Netscape had just gone public. Most people thought the internet was for sharing documents and sending email, not for running serious business applications. But Paul saw something different. He saw that the web could become a platform, that software could move from desktop computers into browsers, that distribution could become instant and frictionless. He called his college friend Robert Morris, a brilliant programmer who had become infamous years earlier for accidentally releasing the first internet worm. Robert was working at MIT. Paul pitched him the idea: build software that stores could use to set up online shops. They would call it ViaWeb. Robert said yes. They started coding immediately. Neither of them knew how to run a business. Neither had ever built commercial software. They were academics who could write elegant code but knew nothing about sales, marketing, or managing employees. They were making it up as they went. The next 2 years were brutal. They worked constantly, lived on ramen and cheap pizza, wrote code until 3 in the morning, then got up and did it again. They had no idea if anyone would want what they were building. The technology barely worked. Browsers crashed constantly. Connections were slow. But they kept going because they saw something that most people missed. They understood that the web was not just a new way to publish documents. It was a new computing platform. And if you built software that lived on servers and ran in browsers, you could reach customers instantly, update your product constantly, and avoid all the friction of traditional software distribution. By 1998, ViaWeb had thousands of customers. Yahoo noticed. They made an offer, $49 million. Paul and Robert sold. Paul was 33 years old and suddenly wealthy. He could have retired. He could have gone back to academia. He could have started another company. Instead, he did something unexpected. He started writing essays about startups, about programming, about thinking clearly. He published them on his personal website. They spread through the early internet, passed around by email and posted on forums. People resonated with his ideas because he wrote clearly about things that mattered: how to build things people want, why nerds and business people misunderstand each other, what makes good design, how to think independently. The essays led to something bigger. In 2005, Paul and his wife Jessica Livingston, along with Robert Morris and Trevor Blackwell, started Y Combinator. The idea was simple but radical. Instead of investing large amounts in a few startups the way traditional venture capitalists did, they would invest small amounts in many startups. They would fund companies when they were just ideas, when it was just a few people with laptops. They would create a program, a batch system where they funded multiple companies at once, gave them a small amount of money, maybe $20,000, brought them to Silicon Valley for 3 months, gave them advice and connections, then helped them pitch to investors at a demo day. Everyone thought they were crazy. $20,000 was not enough to build a company. You could not evaluate ideas that early. Batches did not make sense. You needed to focus on one company at a time. The conventional wisdom was that early-stage investing required deep due diligence, large investments, and close involvement with a small number of companies. Y Combinator ignored all of that. They bet that by funding more companies earlier and cheaper, by creating a community of founders who could help each other, by systematizing startup advice, they could find and help great founders more effectively than traditional investors. They were right. The first batch of Y Combinator had 8 companies. One of them was Reddit. Future batches included Dropbox, Airbnb, Stripe, Coinbase, Instacart, DoorDash, and hundreds of others. By 2025, Y Combinator companies were worth over $300 billion combined. They had funded more than 4,000 companies. They had changed how startups were funded and built. They had helped create thousands of jobs, billions in value, and entirely new industries. But the story of how Paul Graham became Paul Graham, of how an awkward kid from Pittsburgh who loved painting and programming became one of the most influential people in technology, requires understanding the world he came from, the experiences that shaped him, and the non-obvious advantages that let him see opportunities others missed. His success was not just about being smart or working hard. It was about a specific combination of skills, experiences, and ways of thinking that created a unique edge. It was about being a painter who could code, a programmer who could write, an academic who understood business, an outsider who saw patterns that insiders missed. It was about decades of preparation for moments he did not know were coming. To understand what made Paul Graham different, we need to go back to the beginning, to the world that made him, to the specific circumstances and experiences that gave him capabilities others lacked. We need to understand not just what he did, but why he could do it when others could not. Paul Graham was born on November 13, 1964, in Weymouth, England. His parents were temporarily living there while his father worked for a nuclear power plant company. But they were American, and when Paul was a few months old, the family moved back to the United States, settling eventually in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Pittsburgh. 1964 was a year of transformation. The Beatles had just arrived in America. The Civil Rights Act passed. The Vietnam War was escalating. The counterculture was beginning to emerge. But in terms of technology, computing, and the world Paul would eventually inhabit, 1964 was a prehistoric age. Computers were massive machines that filled rooms, operated by specialists in white coats. There was no internet, no personal computers, no software industry as we know it. If you wanted to use a computer, you submitted punch cards to a mainframe operator and waited hours or days for results. The idea that individuals would have computers in their homes would have seemed absurd. The idea that those computers would be connected in a global network would have seemed like science fiction. The idea that software would become one of the most valuable industries in the world, that teenagers in garages would build companies worth billions, that code would become a primary form of wealth creation, none of that was imaginable. The future Paul would help create did not exist even as a possibility in most people's minds. But things were beginning to change. 1964 was also the year that Doug Engelbart's team at Stanford Research Institute was developing the computer mouse. It was the year that IBM announced the System/360, the first family of computers designed to work together. It was the year that BASIC, one of the first easy-to-learn programming languages, was being created at Dartmouth. The seeds were being planted. The personal computing revolution was coming, though it would take another decade to arrive. Paul grew up in Monroeville during the 1970s, a time when America was dealing with Vietnam, Watergate, oil crises, and economic stagnation. It was a pessimistic era. The optimism of the 1960s had curdled. People were cynical about government and institutions. But it was also a time when technology was becoming personal. The Altair, one of the first personal computers, launched in 1975 when Paul was 10. The Apple II arrived in 1977. Suddenly, computing was not just for big companies and universities. Kids could learn to program. You could buy a computer and put it in your bedroom. The hobbyist culture was emerging. The hackers were building. This timing mattered. Paul was exactly the right age to be shaped by the personal computer revolution. He was young enough that computers did not seem strange or intimidating, old enough to be intellectually ready when they arrived. He came of age just as the tools were becoming available for individuals to create software, to build things that mattered, to have an impact without needing permission from institutions. Family background, the formative crucible. Paul's father was a nuclear physicist who designed nuclear reactors. His mother stayed home to raise Paul and his younger sister. They were middle class, educated, not wealthy but secure. His father had a PhD. His mother was smart and read constantly. The household valued intelligence and education. Books were everywhere. Thinking clearly mattered. But Paul's parents were not particularly entrepreneurial. His father worked for a big company designing reactors. It was a steady, professional job. There were no family businesses, no tradition of starting companies, no dinner table conversations about markets and customers and competition. Paul did not grow up learning business from his parents. That would come later, through painful experience. What he did learn from his family was how to think independently. His parents were not particularly religious or ideological. They did not push him toward conventional paths. When Paul became obsessed with things, computers, painting, writing, they let him pursue those obsessions. They gave him freedom to figure out what interested him. This mattered more than it seemed at the time. Many of the advantages Paul would later have came from being allowed to follow his curiosity without pressure to conform to normal paths. His father's work as a physicist also provided a model. Physics was about understanding how things really work, about seeing past surface explanations to underlying principles, about thinking clearly about complex systems. Paul would later apply this same approach to programming, to startups, to understanding markets and human behavior. The physicist's mindset, the insistence on clarity and first principles, became central to how he thought. But his father was also somewhat distant emotionally, absorbed in his work, not particularly expressive. Paul grew up with a certain reserve, an awkwardness in social situations that he would struggle with for years. He was not naturally good at reading people or navigating social dynamics. This made him an outsider in many ways, but it also gave him distance to observe things clearly. He was not swept up in social games. He was watching from the outside, trying to figure out how things worked. His mother was warmer, more emotionally available. She encouraged his reading and thinking. She was intellectually curious herself. But she was also anxious, worried about things. Paul absorbed some of that anxiety, that sense that the world was unpredictable and potentially dangerous. This made him cautious in some ways, but it also made him think carefully about risks and second-order effects. He learned early that things could go wrong, that you needed to think through consequences. Childhood experiences, show don't tell. Paul was a weird kid. He knew it. Other kids knew it. He was not interested in sports. He was not good at small talk. He preferred reading to playing outside. He got obsessed with things in ways that other kids did not understand. When he discovered something interesting, he wanted to understand it completely, to go as deep as possible. This made him strange to his peers but gave him the ability to develop real expertise. His first obsession was with science and engineering. He loved taking things apart to see how they worked. He built model rockets and tried to figure out the physics of how they flew. He read science books meant for adults. He asked questions that teachers could not answer. He wanted to understand how the world actually worked, not just memorize facts for tests. Then, when he was around 10 years old, he discovered computers. His school got a mini-computer, a time-sharing system where students could write simple programs. Paul was immediately fascinated. Programming made sense to him in a way that other things did not. It was a pure world of logic and creation. You could build things just by thinking clearly. If your code did not work, it was your fault, and you could fix it by understanding what went wrong. There was no ambiguity, no politics, no luck. Just clear thinking and hard work. He taught himself to program, spending hours at the computer terminal writing simple programs, games, anything to keep using the machine. He loved the immediacy of it. You wrote code, you ran it, you saw what happened. The feedback loop was tight. You could experiment and learn quickly. This was different from school, where you did assignments and waited days for grades, where the connection between effort and outcome was fuzzy. But computers in 1975 were primitive. Memory was expensive. Storage was limited. Programs had to be small and efficient. This constraint taught Paul to write tight, elegant code. He learned to think carefully about every line, to find the simplest way to express an idea. This emphasis on simplicity and elegance would become central to his philosophy of programming and design. The other obsession that emerged during childhood was art. Paul loved to draw and paint. He was good at it. He could see shapes and colors and proportions in ways that other people could not. He spent hours sketching and painting, trying to capture what he saw. His parents encouraged this. They bought him art supplies and books about art history. He studied the masters, trying to understand what made great painting great. This combination of programming and art was unusual. Most people were either technical or artistic, not both. But Paul saw connections. Both involved making things. Both required seeing what others missed. In programming, you had to see the simple structure hidden in complex problems. In painting, you had to see the shapes and colors and relationships that were really there, not what you thought was there. Both required taste, the ability to distinguish good from bad, elegant from clunky. His social life was difficult. He did not fit in. He was not athletic. He was not cool. He had a few friends who were also weird and smart, but he was lonely much of the time. Other kids thought he was strange. He thought they were boring. This outsider status hurt, but it also gave him independence. He learned early that he did not need to follow the crowd. He could figure out what mattered to him and ignore what everyone else thought was important. One formative experience came when he was in middle school. He realized that much of what school taught was useless. Dates of historical events, grammar rules that no one used, mathematical formulas with no applications. He started to question why he had to learn these things. His teachers could not give good answers. They said you need to know this for tests, or you will need this later. But Paul could see this was not true. Most of what school taught was forgotten immediately after tests. It had no use in the real world. This realization made him skeptical of authority and conventional wisdom. If school, the institution that supposedly prepared you for life, was teaching mostly useless things, what else were people wrong about? What other conventional beliefs were actually false? This skepticism would become fundamental to how he thought. He learned to question everything, to look past what people said to what was actually true. Education, intellectual formation. Paul went to Cornell University in 1982 to study philosophy. This was an unusual choice for someone interested in computers and programming. Most people in that era who wanted to work with technology majored in computer science or electrical engineering. But Paul was interested in fundamental questions about thinking and knowledge. Philosophy seemed like the right place to explore those questions. At Cornell, he studied epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. How do we know what we know? What makes a belief justified? What is the relationship between language and thought? These were abstract questions, far removed from practical concerns. But they taught Paul how to think with precision, how to distinguish between arguments that sounded good and arguments that were actually valid, how to spot hidden assumptions and logical fallacies. He also studied computer science, though not as his main focus. He took classes in algorithms and programming languages. He learned Lisp, a programming language that was popular in artificial intelligence research. Lisp was different from other languages. It was more abstract, more mathematical. You could treat code as data and data as code. You could build programs that wrote programs. This flexibility and power fascinated Paul. He saw that Lisp let you think at a higher level of abstraction than other languages. You could express ideas more concisely and elegantly. But he was frustrated by how computer science was taught. Most classes focused on narrow technical skills, how to implement specific algorithms, how to optimize code for particular machines. They did not teach the deeper questions that interested Paul. What makes a programming language good? How do you design software that is elegant and powerful? What is the relationship between the way you think and the tools you use to express your thoughts? He was also frustrated by philosophy. Most academic philosophy seemed disconnected from anything real. Philosophers wrote papers responding to other papers, engaging in debates that only other philosophers cared about. They used specialized jargon that made their writing impenetrable to outsiders. They prided themselves on precision but often seemed to be precisely wrong, answering questions that did not matter while ignoring questions that did. Paul wanted to think about real problems, questions that had practical implications. He wanted to understand how to make things that were good, whether programs or essays or paintings. He wanted to understand what made some ways of thinking more productive than others. Academic philosophy did not seem interested in these questions. It was more concerned with clever arguments than with truth. After Cornell, Paul went to Harvard for graduate school in computer science. He did a PhD in programming languages, focusing on how to make languages more flexible and powerful. His dissertation was on a technique for automatically separating concerns in programs, making it easier to write clean, modular code. It was good technical work, carefully done, but he knew even while writing it that academic computer science was not where he wanted to spend his life. Graduate school taught him a lot, though not always what the professors intended. He learned how to do research, how to read papers critically, how to identify important problems. He learned that most academic work was incremental and cautious, small improvements on existing ideas rather than fundamental breakthroughs. He learned that the incentives in academia rewarded publishing papers, not building things that worked or solving real problems. He also learned that he did not want to be an academic. The lifestyle seemed stifling. You had to spend years writing grant proposals, dealing with university politics, teaching classes you did not care about. You had to publish constantly, churning out papers whether or not you had anything important to say. Success meant getting tenure at a good university, then continuing to publish until you retired. It seemed like a narrow, constrained life. But the most important thing Paul learned during graduate school did not come from classes or research. It came from writing. He started writing essays, not academic papers but informal pieces about ideas that interested him. He wrote about programming, about thinking clearly, about what made good design. He showed these essays to friends. Some of them resonated. People passed them around. Paul discovered that he was good at explaining complex ideas in simple language, at seeing connections between different domains, at articulating things that people felt but could not express. This ability to write clearly would become one of his most important advantages. Most people in technology could not write well. Engineers wrote in jargon. Academics wrote in impenetrable prose. Business people wrote in corporate speak. But Paul could take complex ideas and make them clear and compelling. He could write essays that made people think differently. This skill would later let him build an audience, establish credibility, and communicate ideas that changed how people thought about startups and technology. Early career, the formation years. After finishing his PhD in 1990, Paul did not know what to do. He could have gotten a faculty position somewhere, but he knew he did not want that life. He could have gotten a job at a big company like IBM or Microsoft, but that also seemed unappealing. He wanted to do something different, though he was not sure what. He moved to Florence, Italy to study painting at the Accademia di Belle Arti. This seemed crazy to most people. He had just spent years getting a PhD in computer science from Harvard. He could have well-paying jobs. Instead, he was moving to Italy to be an art student. But Paul was following his curiosity. He had always loved painting. He wanted to get good at it. He wanted to understand what made great art great. The year in Florence was transformative, though not in the way he expected. He learned a lot about painting, about seeing and color and composition. He learned from studying the old masters, from trying to understand how they achieved their effects. But he also learned something more important. He learned what it meant to work on something for its own sake, not for grades or approval or money. He learned to trust his own judgment, to distinguish between work that was actually good and work that just looked impressive. He also learned that he was not going to be a great painter. He was good, but not exceptional. Great painters had a level of obsession and natural ability that he did not have. He could see the difference. This was discouraging, but also clarifying. He realized he needed to find something where his specific combination of abilities gave him an edge, where he could be exceptional rather than merely good. After Florence, Paul returned to the United States and struggled to figure out what to do. He was in his late 20s, broke, with a PhD that did not seem useful for anything he wanted to do. He wrote a book about Lisp programming. It was well received by the small community of Lisp programmers, but did not make much money. He tried to get consulting work but was not good at sales. He was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, sharing an apartment, barely getting by. Then, in 1995, the web happened. Suddenly, there was this new platform, this new possibility. Paul saw immediately that the web was important, that it was going to change how software worked. Most people thought the web was just for publishing documents, for replacing newspapers and magazines. But Paul saw that it could be a computing platform, that you could build applications that ran in web browsers, that distribution could become instant and frictionless. He had an idea. What if you built software that let small businesses create online stores? This was before e-commerce was common, before Amazon had proven that people would buy things online. Most businesses did not have websites. Those that did had static pages that rarely changed. The idea of building an online store seemed complicated and expensive. But Paul thought he could make it easy. He thought he could build software that would let anyone create an online store in minutes, with no technical knowledge required. He called his college friend Robert Morris. Robert was famous, or infamous, for having created the first internet worm in 1988 while he was a graduate student. It was an accident. He was trying to measure the size of the internet, but the worm spread out of control and crashed thousands of computers. Robert was prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, convicted, but given probation rather than prison time. By 1995, he was working as a researcher at MIT, brilliant at low-level systems programming, able to make code run fast and efficiently. Paul pitched Robert the idea. They would build software that ran on servers and delivered through web browsers. Customers would not need to install anything. They could just sign up and start building their store. Paul and Robert would handle all the servers and software maintenance. It would be a service, not a product. This was a new model. Most software at the time was shipped on floppy disks or CDs, installed on individual computers. The idea of software as a service was not yet common. Robert agreed to join. They started ViaWeb in January 1996. Neither of them knew what they were doing. Neither had run a business. Neither knew how to sell or market or manage employees. They were just two programmers with an idea, working out of a small office in Cambridge, living on ramen and determination. The secret sources of success. The non-obvious advantages. What made Paul Graham exceptional was not any single skill or attribute. It was a specific combination of capabilities and experiences that created unique advantages. Understanding these advantages requires looking past the obvious, past the Harvard PhD and the successful startup, to the non-obvious sources of edge that let him see opportunities others missed and execute in ways others could not. The first advantage was synthetic thinking. Paul could see connections between domains that most people thought were separate. He understood art and programming. He understood philosophy and business. He understood theory and practice. Most people specialized, going deep in one area. Paul went broad, learning enough in multiple domains to see patterns and principles that transcended any single field. This ability to synthesize came partly from his diverse interests and experiences. The year studying painting in Florence, the PhD in computer science, the background in philosophy, the experience building ViaWeb, each of these gave him a different lens for understanding problems. When he looked at startups, he could see them as art projects that need to be beautiful and compelling. He could see them as engineering challenges that need elegant solutions. He could see them as philosophical questions about value and meaning. He could see them as practical businesses that need to make money and grow. Most people in technology thought in narrow categories. Engineers focused on making things work. Business people focused on making money. Designers focused on making things beautiful. But Paul could hold all of these perspectives simultaneously. He could think about whether something was technically elegant, financially viable, and aesthetically compelling all at once. This let him spot opportunities that people stuck in single disciplines missed. The second advantage was clarity of thought. Paul had an unusual ability to see through confusion and complexity to underlying simplicity. This came partly from his training in philosophy, which taught him to distinguish between arguments that sounded good and arguments that were actually valid. It came partly from his experience programming, which taught him that complex systems are usually built from simple components. It came partly from his personality, a deep discomfort with bullshit and pretension that made him allergic to fuzzy thinking. This clarity let him see when conventional wisdom was wrong. Most people in any field operate on unexamined assumptions, beliefs that everyone shares but no one has actually verified. Paul had a habit of questioning these assumptions, of asking why everyone believed something and whether it was actually true. Sometimes the conventional wisdom turned out to be correct. But often, it was wrong, based on outdated circumstances or faulty reasoning. When Paul found these errors, he could see opportunities that others missed. For example, when he started ViaWeb, conventional wisdom said that real businesses needed to license software and install it on their own servers. The idea of running critical business software on someone else's servers seemed risky and unprofessional. But Paul questioned this assumption. Why did you need to run software locally? What if the software on someone else's servers was more reliable, more frequently updated, and easier to use? What if the benefits of centralized software outweighed the perceived risks? By questioning the conventional wisdom, he saw the opportunity for software as a service years before most people. The third advantage was taste. Paul had an intuitive sense of what was good and what was not, whether in code, writing, design, or ideas. This came partly from his experience with art, which taught him to see quality and distinguish between work that was technically competent and work that was actually great. It came partly from reading widely, from studying what made some writing clear and compelling and other writing confused and boring. It came partly from programming in Lisp, which emphasized elegance and abstraction. This taste let him make better decisions than people who relied purely on analysis or conventional metrics. When evaluating startups, most investors looked at metrics like revenue growth, customer acquisition cost, and market size. These metrics were useful, but they did not capture everything that mattered. Paul could also evaluate the quality of the founders' thinking, the elegance of their product, the coherence of their vision. He could see when something had the qualities that led to greatness even if the current metrics were not impressive. The fourth advantage was independence. Paul did not care much what other people thought. This was partly temperament, an innate discomfort with conformity and authority. It was partly the result of being an outsider growing up, of never quite fitting in socially. It was partly philosophical conviction, a deep belief that you should figure out what is true and do what is right regardless of what others think. This independence let him make contrarian bets that turned out to be correct. When he started Y Combinator, almost everyone in the venture capital industry thought it was a bad idea. Investing small amounts in very early companies did not make sense according to conventional VC wisdom. But Paul did not care what conventional VCs thought. He believed that funding more companies earlier and cheaper was a better model. He was willing to try it and see what happened, regardless of what the establishment thought. The fifth advantage was ability to communicate. Paul could explain complex ideas in simple, clear language. He could write essays that made people think differently. He could articulate patterns and principles that others felt but could not express. This came partly from natural ability, but mostly from practice. He had spent years writing, first academic papers, then informal essays, learning how to make ideas clear and compelling. This communication ability gave him leverage. When he wrote essays about startups, those essays spread widely and influenced how people thought. When he gave advice to founders, they listened and remembered because he could explain things clearly. When he needed to convince investors or customers or employees, he could articulate his vision in ways that resonated. Most people in technology were not good at communicating. Paul was exceptional at it, and this gave him enormous influence. The sixth advantage was network effects. Paul had built relationships with smart, capable people over decades. These relationships compounded in value over time. Robert Morris was one of the best systems programmers alive. Jessica Livingston understood people and operations. Trevor Blackwell could build anything. The founders Paul funded connected him to more founders. The essays he wrote built an audience of smart readers. Each connection created opportunities for more connections. But the network effects went deeper than just knowing people. Paul had credibility. When he said something, people paid attention because he had a track record of being right. When he backed a startup, other investors noticed because Paul's judgment was respected. When he published an essay, it got read because people knew it would contain insights. This credibility was earned slowly, built up through years of doing good work and making good decisions. Once established, it became a powerful advantage. The seventh advantage, and perhaps most important, was taste for promising problems. Paul had an intuition for which problems were worth solving, which opportunities were real and which were mirages. This came from diverse experience. He had built software, so he understood what was technically possible and what was hard. He had studied art, so he understood what resonated with people and what fell flat. He had read widely, so he understood historical patterns and how technologies evolved. This let him spot opportunities early. He saw that the web would become a platform for applications, not just documents. He saw that software as a service would replace locally installed software. He saw that startups could be funded much earlier and cheaper than conventional wisdom suggested. He saw that the best founders were often young outsiders with fresh perspectives rather than experienced operators. Each of these insights came from being able to see patterns and extrapolate how things would develop. The meta pattern, how the advantages combined. These advantages did not operate independently. They reinforced each other, creating capabilities that were more than the sum of their parts. Paul's clarity of thought made his writing more effective. His synthetic thinking let him see patterns that informed his taste for problems. His independence gave him freedom to follow his judgment even when it contradicted conventional wisdom. His network effects amplified his influence and gave him access to opportunities. The combination was rare. Many people were smart. Many were independent. Many could write well. But very few combined all these capabilities. And fewer still applied them to the specific domain of startups and technology at the specific moment when the internet was creating unprecedented opportunities. This was not luck, exactly. Paul had deliberately cultivated these capabilities over decades. He studied painting to develop taste. He studied philosophy to improve his thinking. He practiced writing to communicate clearly. He questioned conventional wisdom to develop independence. But there was also fortune in the timing, in coming of age just as personal computers and then the internet were creating opportunities for individuals to build valuable things without needing permission from institutions. The secret sources of Paul's success were not hidden superpowers or insider knowledge. They were capabilities developed through years of diverse experience, applied to opportunities that most people did not recognize, executed with independence and clarity that most people lacked. Understanding these sources reveals something important about how exceptional achievement works. It is rarely about one big advantage. It is about combining multiple advantages in ways that create unique capabilities, then applying those capabilities to important problems at the right time. The journey through historic events. Era 1, the dot-com boom and bust, 1995 to 2002. When Paul and Robert started Viaweb in January 1996, the internet was at an inflection point. Netscape had gone public in August 1995, and its stock price had doubled on the first day of trading. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be part of the internet. Money was pouring into internet companies. Venture capitalists who had been skeptical a year earlier were now desperate to fund anything related to the web. The boom was beginning. But the infrastructure was primitive. Most people had dial-up connections that were painfully slow. Browsers crashed constantly. JavaScript, the programming language that would later make web applications possible, was brand new and buggy. The idea of running serious business software in a web browser seemed crazy. Desktop software like Microsoft Office was where the real action was. the web was for hobbyists and researchers, not for running actual businesses. Paul and Robert saw something different. They understood that the web's advantages, instant distribution, centralized updates, cross-platform compatibility, would eventually outweigh its current limitations. They understood that browsers would get better, connections would get faster, and web applications would become more powerful. They were building for the future they saw coming, not the present that existed. The early days of ViaWeb were brutally hard. Paul and Robert worked constantly, coding, debugging, trying to make the software work reliably. They had almost no money. Paul was living on what remained of his book advance. Robert had savings from his MIT salary. They rented a tiny office in Cambridge, furnished with cheap desks and folding chairs. They ate ramen and pizza. They barely slept. The technical challenges were immense. Web browsers in 1996 were inconsistent and buggy. What worked in Netscape might not work in Internet Explorer. JavaScript was so new that different browsers implemented it differently. Making software that worked reliably across different browsers, on different operating systems, over slow dial-up connections, was incredibly difficult. Most of what they built broke constantly. They would fix one problem and create two more. It was exhausting and demoralizing. But they kept going because they believed the idea was right. They believed that making it easy for small businesses to sell online was valuable. They believed that software as a service was the future. They believed that if they could just make it work, customers would want it. And slowly, painfully, they made progress. The software got more reliable. Features got added. Customers started signing up. The first customers were small businesses that wanted to sell online but could not afford to hire programmers or buy expensive e-commerce software. They were bookstores, gift shops, artisan craftspeople, anyone with products to sell. ViaWeb let them create an online store in an hour. They could add products, set prices, customize the design, and start selling. The software handled everything: payment processing, order management, inventory tracking. It was not perfect, but it worked, and it was dramatically easier and cheaper than alternatives. As customers accumulated, Paul and Robert learned about sales and support and all the unglamorous parts of running a business. They learned that customers did not care about elegant code or clever technical solutions. They cared about whether the software helped them make money. They learned that bugs that seemed minor to programmers were major problems for customers trying to run their businesses. They learned that customers wanted features they had not planned to build and did not care about features they had spent weeks implementing. This was humbling. Paul and Robert were brilliant programmers, but they were not business people. They did not know how to sell or market or position their product. They did not know how to hire or manage or create a company culture. They had to learn everything from scratch, making mistakes, fixing problems, gradually figuring out what worked. One key decision that shaped ViaWeb's success was to let customers have direct access to the software's HTML and CSS. Most competitors gave customers only limited customization options. They could choose from templates, pick colors, but not control the actual code. Paul and Robert took the opposite approach. They built powerful tools for non-technical users, but they also let sophisticated users edit the HTML directly. This made ViaWeb more flexible and powerful than competitors. This decision reflected Paul's philosophy about software design. Give users as much power and control as possible, but make the common cases easy. Do not try to anticipate everything users might want. Instead, build flexible tools and let users figure out what to do with them. This approach was riskier. It meant users could break things, but it also meant ViaWeb could do things competitors could not. By early 1998, ViaWeb had thousands of customers and was growing fast. They had raised some venture capital funding. They had hired employees. They had actual office space. They were still working incredibly hard, but they were succeeding. The software was reliable. Customers were happy. Revenue was growing. They had built something real. Then Yahoo contacted them. Yahoo was one of the biggest internet companies, the dominant search engine and web portal. They wanted to get into e-commerce. They looked at building their own e-commerce platform but decided it would be faster and easier to buy via web. They made an offer in the spring of 1998, $49 million. Paul and Robert sold. After 2.5 years of grinding work, they were suddenly wealthy. Paul was 33 years old and had more money than he had ever imagined having. The acquisition was bittersweet. On one hand, they had succeeded. They had built valuable software and sold it for a significant amount of money. They had proven that web-based applications were viable. They had demonstrated that software as a service could work. On the other hand, they lost control of what they had built. Yahoo rebranded ViaWeb as Yahoo Store and made changes that Paul thought made it worse. The elegant simplicity they had worked to create got buried under Yahoo's corporate processes and politics. But the experience taught Paul essential lessons that would shape everything he did later. He learned that startups were hard not just technically but in all dimensions. You had to solve technical problems, but also sales problems, marketing problems, hiring problems, management problems. He learned that building a product people wanted was necessary but not sufficient. You also had to figure out how to reach customers, how to price your product, how to support users, how to scale operations. He learned that timing mattered enormously. ViaWeb succeeded partly because they had the right idea at the right time. A few years earlier, and the web infrastructure would not have been ready. A few years later, and there would have been too many competitors. They hit the window when the opportunity was real but not yet obvious to everyone. He learned that conventional wisdom was often wrong. Everyone said that serious businesses would never run critical software on someone else's servers. But customers loved not having to install and maintain software. Everyone said web applications could not compete with desktop software. But for many use cases, web applications were good enough and much more convenient. Most importantly, he learned what he was good at and what he was not good at. He was good at seeing opportunities early, at building elegant software, at thinking clearly about technical and strategic questions. He was not good at sales, at managing people, at corporate politics. This self-knowledge would be crucial later when he started Y Combinator. He would structure it to leverage his strengths and minimize his weaknesses. The ViaWeb exit left Paul with two things that would prove invaluable. First, money. Not enough to retire, but enough to have freedom, to work on what he wanted without worrying about paying rent. Second, credibility. He had built a successful startup and sold it. People would take him seriously when he talked about startups and technology. These assets, money and credibility, would enable everything he did next. Era TWO, The Essays and the Audience, 2000 to 2005. After Yahoo bought ViaWeb in 1998, Paul had to stay for a few years to complete his earn-out agreement. He moved to California, worked at Yahoo headquarters in Silicon Valley, and hated almost every moment of it. He was working for a big company now, dealing with meetings and processes and politics. The elegant software he and Robert had built was being modified by committees. Features were added that made no sense. The simplicity was disappearing under layers of corporate compromise. But the experience was educational in a different way. Paul got to see how a big internet company operated. He saw how decisions were made, or not made. He saw how politics and careerism distorted incentives. He saw brilliant engineers writing mediocre code because that was what the organization rewarded. He saw good ideas get rejected because they did not fit the political moment. He saw why big companies struggled to innovate while small startups could move fast and try new things. By 2000, Paul had completed his earn-out and was free to leave Yahoo. He moved back to Cambridge and had to figure out what to do next. He was 35 years old with money in the bank and no clear path forward. He could start another company. He could become an investor. He could go back to programming or painting or writing. He had options but no obvious choice. He started writing essays and publishing them on his personal website. The essays were about topics he was thinking about: what makes good programming languages, why nerds are unpopular in school, what it means to do great work. The writing was clear and informal, not academic but thoughtful. He was writing for himself, trying to understand ideas that interested him. He did not think many people would read the essays. He was just putting his thoughts online. But people did read them. The essay spread through email and forums. People linked to them, discussed them, shared them with friends. Within a few months, Paul had an audience. Thousands of people were reading his essays. Some of them were influential programmers, investors, entrepreneurs. His writing was resonating because he was articulating ideas that people cared about but had not seen expressed so clearly. This surprised Paul. He had always thought of himself as a programmer who could write, not a writer who could program. But he discovered he was good at writing in a way that connected with people. He was good at taking complex ideas and making them accessible. He was good at seeing patterns and explaining them. He was good at questioning conventional wisdom and articulating better alternatives. The essay that really established Paul's reputation was called Hackers and Painters, published in May 2003. In it, he argued that programming was more like painting than like engineering. He argued that hackers, good programmers, were makers who cared about beauty and elegance, not just functionality. He argued that the best way to learn programming was through making things, through practice and iteration, not through formal study and credentials. This resonated deeply with programmers who felt constrained by formal methodologies and corporate processes. It articulated something many felt but had not seen expressed, that programming could be creative and playful, that code could be beautiful, that making things was its own reward. The essay was widely read and discussed. It established Paul as someone who understood not just the technical aspects of programming but its creative and philosophical dimensions. He followed with more essays. What You Can't Say explored how to think about ideas that society considers unacceptable. The 100-Year Language imagined what programming languages might look like in the future. How to Make Wealth explained that wealth is created by making things people want, not by taking from others. Each essay explored ideas he was genuinely curious about, and each found an audience because Paul was writing about things that mattered and doing so with clarity and originality. The essays built credibility and audience over time. By 2004, Paul had become an influential voice in technology. When he wrote something, it got read. When he expressed an opinion, people paid attention. This influence was not planned or sought. It emerged organically from writing well about interesting topics. But once established, it became a powerful asset that would enable what came next. The essay writing also clarified Paul's thinking about startups and technology. By trying to explain ideas clearly to others, he had to understand them clearly himself. By articulating principles and patterns, he developed frameworks for thinking about complex topics. The essays were a form of research, a way of exploring ideas by writing about them. This prepared him intellectually for starting Y Combinator. During these years, Paul also became more connected to the startup community in Silicon Valley. He moved to California, partly to be where things were happening. He attended parties and dinners where startup founders and investors gathered. He met people who were building companies, people who were investing in them, people who were thinking about how the technology industry worked. These relationships and conversations informed his understanding of startups and revealed patterns in what worked and what did not. One conversation was particularly influential. Paul was talking with Trevor Blackwell, a friend from graduate school who had become a successful entrepreneur. They were discussing how hard it was to start a company. You needed to raise money, which was difficult if you did not have connections. You needed to hire employees, which was hard if you did not have revenue. You needed to figure out what to build, which was hard if you did not have experience. The barriers seemed designed to keep outsiders out, to advantage people who were already established. Paul started thinking about how to lower these barriers. What if you could make it easier to start companies? What if you could give founders money before they had a product, before they had revenue, just when they had an idea and determination? What if you could create a program that taught people how to start companies, that gave them advice and connections and support? What if you could do this systematically, funding many companies at once rather than one at a time? This thinking led to Y Combinator, but it emerged from years of experience and reflection. Paul had built a startup himself, so he knew what founders needed. He had written essays about startups, so he had articulated frameworks for thinking about them. He had credibility and connections, so people would take him seriously. The pieces were coming together, though Paul did not fully realize it yet. The key insight was that early-stage startup investing was being done wrong. Traditional venture capitalists invested large amounts, say $1 to $5 million, in companies that already had products and customers. This made sense for VCs because their fund sizes and partnership structures required making big bets. But it meant that founders had to get pretty far on their own before they could raise VC money. They had to build a product, get customers, prove traction, all without significant capital. This was incredibly hard and filtered out many potential founders who had good ideas but lacked resources. Paul saw that you could flip this model. Instead of investing large amounts in later-stage companies, you could invest small amounts in very early companies. Instead of waiting for founders to prove themselves, you could help them prove themselves. Instead of funding one company at a time, you could fund many companies together, creating a batch where founders could help each other. The economics worked if you invested in many companies cheaply. You would have more failures, but also more successes, and the best successes would return enough to make up for all the failures. This model contradicted conventional VC wisdom. VCs believed you needed to invest enough to matter, that small investments meant small outcomes. They believed you needed to spend time with companies to add value, that funding many companies meant spreading yourself too thin. They believed that early-stage companies were too risky, that you needed to wait until companies had reduced risk through traction before investing. But Paul thought the conventional wisdom was wrong. He thought small investments could lead to big outcomes if the startup succeeded. He thought you could add value through advice and connections rather than time-intensive involvement. He thought early-stage companies were risky, but that risk could be managed by diversifying across many companies. Most importantly, he thought there were many potential founders who had good ideas but lacked the resources and knowledge to start companies. If you could help those founders, you could fund great companies that would never have existed otherwise. Era 3, the Y Combinator years, 2005 to 2014. In March 2005, Paul Graham, Jessica Livingston, Robert Morris, and Trevor Blackwell officially started Y Combinator. The name came from a concept in programming. A Y Combinator is a higher-order function that allows recursion without explicit self-reference. The metaphor was fitting. Y Combinator would be a program that created startup programs, a meta-organization that helped organizations form. The initial idea was simple but radical. They would fund startups when they were just ideas, giving small amounts of money, initially $6,000, later $20,000, to founders who had technical ability and interesting ideas but nothing else. They would bring multiple startups together in a batch, give them 3 months to build and grow, provide them with advice and connections, then help them pitch to investors at a demo day. They would fund many startups cheaply rather than a few startups expensively. The first batch of Y Combinator started in summer 2005. They funded 8 companies. The application process was minimal, just a web form asking basic questions about the founders and their ideas. Paul, Jessica, Robert, and Trevor reviewed the applications, picked companies that seemed promising, and invited the founders to Cambridge for the summer. The founders would work on their startups, meet with Paul for weekly dinners where they would discuss problems and get advice, and prepare to pitch investors at the end of the summer. Everything about Y Combinator contradicted conventional wisdom. The investment amount, $6,000, was laughably small by VC standards. Traditional VCs invested millions. $6,000 would not even cover living expenses for 3 months. How could companies build anything meaningful with so little capital? The answer was that founders were resourceful. They could live cheaply, work out of apartments, use free or open-source tools, and build prototypes without significant capital. The money was not supposed to fund the company long-term. It was supposed to give founders a few months to focus full-time on their startup without starving. The batch model also seemed crazy. How could you advise 8 companies at once? Traditional investors spent significant time with each portfolio company, attending board meetings, advising on strategy, making introductions. Paul could not do that for 8 companies, especially while also running Y Combinator itself. But Paul was not trying to replicate the traditional investor role. He was trying to provide something different, frameworks and principles that applied across companies, a community where founders could help each other, and introductions to investors and customers. This did not require intense one-on-one time. It required articulating principles clearly and creating an environment where founders could learn from each other. The demo day concept was also novel. Traditional startups raised money through individual meetings with investors, one pitch at a time over weeks or months. Y Combinator compressed this into a single event where all the batch companies presented to a room full of investors. This was more efficient for both founders and investors. Founders did not have to spend months fundraising. Investors could see many companies in a few hours. The batch created competitive dynamics too. If one investor showed interest in a company, others noticed and wanted to see what they were missing. This often led to multiple term sheets and better terms for founders. The first batch validated the model. Out of 8 companies, one was Reddit, a link-sharing site that 2 founders, Steve Huffman and Alexis Ohanian, had pivoted to during the summer. Reddit grew rapidly, got acquired by Condé Nast in 2006 for an amount reported to be between $10 and $20 million, then eventually spun back out and became one of the most popular websites on the internet. The other companies from the first batch mostly failed or had modest outcomes, but Reddit alone proved that the model could find and help exceptional founders early. Y Combinator quickly became popular. The second batch in winter 2006 funded 12 companies. The third batch in summer 2006 funded 11 companies. Applications increased with each batch. Word spread that Y Combinator was different, that they were friendly to founders, that they provided real help, that demo day was a good way to raise money. Founders who might have struggled to break into traditional venture capital networks now had a path. If they got into Y Combinator, they would get funding, advice, and access to investors. But the real breakthrough came in the next few years as companies from early batches became successful. Looped, from summer 2005, got acquired for $43 million. Zobni, from summer 2006, got acquired for $60 million. Dropbox, from winter 2007, became one of the most successful startups of its era, reaching billions in valuation. Airbnb, from winter 2009, became even bigger, revolutionizing short-term rentals and reaching valuations over $100 billion. These successes established Y Combinator's reputation. They showed that funding companies extremely early could lead to exceptional outcomes. They showed that the batch model worked, that founders could build impressive companies in 3 months. They showed that Paul's advice and frameworks were valuable. Most importantly, they showed that there were many talented founders outside the traditional networks, people who could build great companies if given a small amount of capital and support. Paul's role in these early years was crucial. He ran the weekly dinners during each batch where founders would present their progress and problems. Paul would listen, ask questions, and give advice. The advice was tactical: how to talk to users, how to decide what to build, how to deal with co-founder disputes, how to handle investor meetings. But it was also philosophical: what matters in startups versus what just seems like it should matter, how to distinguish real problems from fake ones, how to make decisions with incomplete information. The weekly dinners became famous among Y Combinator founders. Paul had a way of cutting through confusion and identifying what really mattered. Founders would come with complex problems, tangled messes of competing concerns. Paul would ask a few questions and identify the core issue. He would see what was important and what was distraction. This clarity was incredibly valuable to founders who were overwhelmed and uncertain. Paul also wrote essays during these years that codified Y Combinator's philosophy. How to Start a Startup laid out the basic principles. Do Things That Don't Scale encouraged founders to do manual work early rather than trying to automate everything. The 18 Mistakes That Kill Startups enumerated common failure modes. Startup equals growth defined what made a company a startup rather than just a small business. Each essay articulated ideas that founders found useful. Each essay spread widely and influenced how people thought about startups. These essays were not just marketing for Y Combinator, though they did attract applicants. They were genuine attempts to understand and explain what made startups succeed or fail. Paul was doing research in public, exploring questions by writing about them. The essays refined his thinking and gave founders frameworks they could use. They also established Paul as the philosopher of the startup world, someone who thought deeply about why things worked the way they did. The success of Y Combinator's early batches attracted more applicants, better founders, and more investor interest. By 2008, Y Combinator was funding 40 to 50 companies per batch. By 2010, it was over 60. By 2012, it was over 80. The growth created scaling challenges. How do you provide individual attention to 80 companies? How do you maintain quality as you grow? How do you preserve the culture and community that made early batches special? Paul and the other Y Combinator partners made several decisions to address these challenges. They brought in more partners to help advise companies. They created office hours where founders could sign up for one-on-one time with partners. They moved from Cambridge to Silicon Valley permanently, since most companies wanted to be in Silicon Valley after Y Combinator anyway. They raised larger funds to accommodate bigger batches. They systematized more of the program, creating standard practices and resources that all companies could access. But they also worked hard to preserve what made Y Combinator special. The dinners continued, though they got bigger and more structured. The culture of helping each other, of founders supporting other founders, remained central. The advice stayed founder-friendly, focused on what was best for companies rather than what was convenient for investors. The demo day format continued to create competitive dynamics that helped founders raise money on good terms. During these years from 2005 to 2014, Y Combinator funded many of the companies that would define the next era of technology. Dropbox revolutionized file sharing and cloud storage. Airbnb transformed travel and short-term rentals. Stripe made online payment simple for developers. Coinbase became the dominant cryptocurrency exchange. Instacart pioneered grocery delivery. DoorDash dominated food delivery. Twitch created live streaming for games. Reddit became one of the most important social networks. These companies created enormous value, billions of dollars in market capitalization, thousands of jobs, entirely new industries. But they also validated Y Combinator's approach. They showed that funding founders early, giving them freedom to experiment, providing frameworks and support rather than heavy-handed direction, worked better than traditional venture capital's approach. They showed that small bets on many companies produced better returns than big bets on a few companies. They showed that opening access to funding, letting anyone apply regardless of connections or credentials, found exceptional founders who would have been missed by traditional networks. Paul's role evolved during these years. He went from being the primary advisor to all companies to being one of several partners. He went from running weekly dinners to overseeing a larger organization with multiple people advising companies. He went from writing most of Y Combinator's essays to having other partners contribute. This evolution was necessary as Y Combinator grew, but it also meant Paul had less direct involvement with each company. By 2014, Paul decided to step back from running Y Combinator day to day. He was 50 years old and had been intensely involved in Y Combinator for 9 years. He wanted more time for other interests, for writing, for painting, for thinking. He also recognized that Y Combinator had grown beyond being about him personally. It was now an institution with many partners, established processes, strong reputation. It could continue successfully without him running it directly. Sam Altman, who had been through Y Combinator with his company Looped in 2005 and had become a Y Combinator partner, took over as president. Other partners stepped into larger roles. Y Combinator continued to grow and succeed, funding larger batches, expanding internationally, building more infrastructure. Paul remained involved but at a distance, advising occasionally, writing essays, maintaining relationships with founders, but not running operations. The Y Combinator era established Paul's legacy. He had created something genuinely new, a systematic way to find and help exceptional founders early, a program that opened access to startup funding, a community that helped founders help each other. Y Combinator became the most influential early-stage investor in technology. It changed how startups were funded and built. It created an ecosystem of successful founders who started new companies, invested in other startups, and spread Y Combinator's philosophy. But it also revealed something important about Paul's abilities and limitations. He was exceptional at seeing patterns, articulating principles, giving advice, and building credibility. He was less good at organizational management, at building processes, at the operational details of running a growing organization. Y Combinator succeeded partly because he focused on what he was good at, the ideas and advice and frameworks, and brought in people like Jessica Livingston who could handle operations and people management. Era 4, the independent years, 2014 to present. After stepping back from Y Combinator in 2014, Paul returned to writing full-time. He had always written essays, but now he could focus on longer, more ambitious pieces. He wrote about topics he found interesting: how to do great work, the importance of independent-mindedness, why people should have children, what makes cities good places to live. The essays were less focused on startups and more focused on broader questions about thinking and living well. These essays continued to build his audience and influence. Each essay articulated ideas that resonated with people, ideas they had felt but not clearly thought through. Paul had a gift for taking fuzzy intuitions and making them precise. He could identify patterns that explained complex phenomena. He could question assumptions that most people did not realize they held. His essays were exercises in clear thinking, models of how to analyze ideas rigorously. One essay from 2019, How to Do Great Work, became particularly influential. It explored what separates exceptional work from merely good work. Paul argued that great work requires a combination of natural ability, hard work, and good taste. You need to find work you have an aptitude for, work that interests you enough that you are willing to think about it obsessively. You need to do the work, to put in the hours and effort. And you need to develop taste, the ability to distinguish between work that is actually good and work that just seems impressive. The essay resonated because it articulated something people felt, that great work requires a specific kind of intensity and care, that it is not just about being smart or working hard but about caring deeply enough to notice what matters and to do it right. Paul was describing his own experience, but also a broader pattern he had seen in others who did exceptional work. He also wrote about more controversial topics. He wrote about income inequality, arguing that it was not inherently bad if it resulted from people creating value rather than extracting it. He wrote about political correctness and how it stifled clear thinking. He wrote about why some cities were better for ambitious people than others. These essays generated more pushback than his writing about startups, but they also showed Paul's willingness to say what he thought was true regardless of whether it was popular. During these years, Paul also became more interested in angel investing. He had always invested in individual startups, but now he had more time to focus on it. He invested in companies at very early stages, often before they had incorporated or raised other money. He was looking for exceptional founders working on important problems, the same pattern he had looked for at Y Combinator but now with his personal money. Some of these investments were in Y Combinator companies, but many were not. Paul was finding founders through his network, through people he knew introducing him to people they knew. His reputation meant that founders wanted him as an investor not just for his money but for his advice and credibility. Having Paul Graham invest in your company was a signal to other investors and customers that someone smart thought you were worth backing. Paul's investment philosophy reflected what he had learned from decades of experience. He looked for founders who were determined and flexible, who had strong opinions but could change their minds when evidence suggested they were wrong. He looked for ideas that seemed unpromising to most people but that actually addressed real problems. He looked for opportunities where conventional wisdom was wrong, where most investors were missing something important. He also became more interested in what he called ambitious ideas, projects that attempted to solve hard, important problems rather than incremental improvements. He wrote about the importance of working on things that matter, not just things that were easy or fashionable. He encouraged founders to think bigger, to attempt things that seemed impossible. He believed that many important problems were not being worked on because they seemed too hard, and that talented people should attempt them anyway. During these years, Paul moved to England with his family. He had always loved Europe, had studied painting in Florence, had spent time in Paris. He wanted his children to grow up with exposure to different cultures and histories. He and his wife Jessica bought a house in the English countryside. Paul continued writing essays, advising founders, and investing, but from a distance from Silicon Valley's intensity. The move to England reflected Paul's independence and his evolving priorities. He was not trying to be at the center of the technology industry anymore. He had done that for decades. Now he wanted space to think and work on what interested him without the constant demands of being involved in Silicon Valley's social and professional networks. He could visit California when needed, but he did not need to live there. Paul also became more interested in systemic questions about technology and society. He wrote about monopolies and whether they were good or bad. He wrote about how cities shape what people work on and how they think. He wrote about the role of prestige in distorting people's choices. He wrote about how to think about risk and uncertainty. These essays showed Paul thinking about bigger questions than just how to build successful startups. He was thinking about how technology and capitalism and human nature interact, about what makes societies good places to live, about what matters in life beyond wealth and success. One important essay from 2020, The Four Quadrants of Conformism, explored different attitudes toward conventional wisdom. Paul argued that people fall into four categories based on two dimensions: whether they actively identify and challenge false beliefs, and whether they publicly express contrarian ideas. Most people are passive and conventional, accepting whatever ideas are dominant without examining them. Some people are independent-minded but keep quiet about their contrarian views. Some people express contrarian ideas but mainly to be edgy rather than because they have thought them through. And a few people actively seek truth and are willing to say what they think is true regardless of whether others agree. Paul placed himself in the fourth category, actively independent-minded and willing to express unpopular views. This described his approach throughout his career. He had questioned conventional wisdom about programming languages, about software architecture, about how to fund startups, about what made companies succeed. He had been willing to act on his contrarian views even when others thought he was wrong. And he had been proven right enough times that people took his contrarian ideas seriously. The essay also reflected Paul's thinking about what makes people effective. He believed that independent-mindedness was crucial for doing important work. If you just followed conventional wisdom, you would work on problems others had already solved or that were not actually important. To do original work, you had to be willing to question assumptions, to explore ideas that seemed weird or wrong to most people, to pursue directions that experts said would not work. This required both intellectual courage and intellectual humility, courage to disagree with consensus and humility to change your mind when you were wrong. During these years, Y Combinator continued to grow and evolve without Paul's daily involvement. Sam Altman ran it until 2019, when he left to focus on OpenAI, the artificial intelligence research company he had co-founded. Jeff Ralston took over as president, continuing Y Combinator's growth. The batches got larger, funding over 300 companies per batch by 2020. The program expanded internationally, accepting companies from around the world. New programs were added, like YC Continuity, which invested in later-stage Y Combinator companies, and YC Growth, which provided resources to help companies scale. Y Combinator's success had changed the early-stage startup ecosystem. Other accelerators were created, some by Y Combinator alumni, copying aspects of Y Combinator's model. Y Combinator companies helped other Y Combinator companies, creating a powerful alumni network. Investors now expected startups to go through accelerators. The 3-month program, the demo day, the small seed investment, all these became standard patterns. Y Combinator had not just succeeded, it had transformed how early-stage startups were funded and built. Paul's relationship with Y Combinator during these years was complicated. He was proud of what Y Combinator had become, proud that it was helping thousands of founders, proud that it had created billions of dollars in value. But he also sometimes disagreed with decisions Y Combinator made. The batches were larger than he thought was ideal. The focus had shifted somewhat from helping founders to maximizing returns for the Y Combinator fund. The culture had changed as the organization grew. These tensions were natural, the founder's vision versus the needs of a growing organization, but they sometimes created friction. By 2025, Paul was 60 years old. He continued writing essays that were widely read. He continued advising founders, though more selectively. He continued investing in early-stage companies. But his focus had shifted from building organizations to exploring ideas, from direct involvement in the startup ecosystem to thinking and writing about broader questions. He had proven what he wanted to prove, that you could systematize early-stage investing, that you could help founders by giving them frameworks and principles, that opening access to funding would find exceptional people. Now he was interested in other questions. Organizations built or transformed. Y Combinator, the institution that changed startup funding. Y Combinator was Paul's most important organizational creation. It started in 2005 as an experiment, a way to test whether funding startups earlier and cheaper than traditional venture capital could work. By 2025, it had become the most influential early-stage investor in technology, having funded over 4,000 companies worth over $300 billion combined. The organization Paul and his co-founders created had several key innovations. The batch model, funding multiple companies at once rather than investing in companies one at a time, created community and competitive dynamics that helped founders. The small investment amount, initially $6,000 and later $20,000, let Y Combinator take bets on companies that were too early for traditional investors. The 3-month program gave founders focused time to build and grow with access to advice and resources. The demo day at the end created efficient fundraising that gave founders leverage with investors. But the deeper innovation was cultural. Y Combinator was founder-friendly in ways that traditional venture capital was not. The terms were simple and fair. The advice focused on what was best for companies rather than what was convenient for investors. The partners had mostly been founders themselves, so they understood the founder's perspective. The culture valued building things and helping other founders. This created loyalty. Y Combinator founders often stayed involved after their batch, advising newer companies, making angel investments, referring other founders. Y Combinator also systematized startup advice in ways that had not been done before. Paul's essays articulated principles that applied across many companies. The weekly dinners during each batch taught founders how to think about common problems. Office hours with partners gave founders access to experienced advice. The alumni network connected founders with others who had solved similar problems. This systematization meant Y Combinator could scale, could help hundreds of companies per batch rather than just a handful. The organization's growth created challenges. How do you maintain quality as you scale? How do you preserve culture as the organization grows? How do you adapt to changes in the startup ecosystem while staying true to your core principles? Y Combinator navigated these challenges with mixed success. Quality remained high, Y Combinator continued to fund exceptional companies. Culture changed somewhat, the later batches felt different from the early ones. Adaptation was constant, programs and policies evolved as the ecosystem changed. By 2025, Y Combinator had become an institution that would outlive its founders. It had procedures and structures and brand recognition that were independent of any individual. It had trained multiple generations of partners who understood the Y Combinator approach. It had an alumni network of thousands of founders who could help newer founders. It had established patterns that other accelerators copied. Paul's vision of making startup funding more accessible and founder-friendly had been realized and institutionalized. Viaweb, the company that validated software as a service. Before Y Combinator, Paul's most significant organizational achievement was Viaweb. The company he and Robert Morris started in 1996 pioneered software as a service years before the term existed. They built an application that ran on their servers and was accessed through web browsers. Customers did not install software. They just signed up and used ViaWeb through their browser. This model seems obvious now, but in 1996 it was radical. ViaWeb succeeded partly because of timing. The web was new enough that established companies had not yet dominated e-commerce, but mature enough that small businesses wanted online stores. Infrastructure was primitive, browsers crashed and connections were slow, but good enough that web applications could work if designed carefully. Paul and Robert hit the window where the opportunity was real but not yet obvious to everyone. But ViaWeb also succeeded because of specific decisions Paul and Robert made. They focused on making the software easy for non-technical users while also giving sophisticated users access to the underlying code. They built reliability into the system, making sure customer stores stayed up and worked correctly. They provided good customer support, helping customers solve problems quickly. They iterated constantly, adding features and fixing bugs based on customer feedback. The company culture Paul and Robert created was focused and pragmatic. They hired carefully, looking for people who were smart and could get things done. They avoided unnecessary meetings and processes. They gave employees freedom to make decisions and solve problems. They worked hard but not in a toxic way. The focus was on building something that worked and that customers wanted, not on impressing investors or building a prestigious company. When Yahoo acquired ViaWeb in 1998, the company had thousands of customers and was growing rapidly. Yahoo rebranded it as Yahoo Store and it continued operating for many years. The acquisition validated Paul and Robert's vision that web applications were viable and valuable. It also provided Paul with money and credibility that enabled everything he did later. The portfolio companies, Dropbox, Airbnb, Stripe, and other. While Paul did not build these companies himself, his role in their early development through Y Combinator was significant. Understanding how Y Combinator helped these companies reveals Paul's approach to adding value and the patterns he saw in exceptional founders. Dropbox came through Y Combinator in winter 2007. The founder, Drew Houston, had a simple idea: make file syncing work reliably across devices. Paul saw immediately why this mattered. Everyone who used multiple computers, a laptop and a desktop, or who worked with others, struggled with file synchronization. Email attachments were clunky. USB drives got lost. Existing sync tools were unreliable. Drew had built a prototype that actually worked, and Paul saw that reliable file syncing would be valuable to millions of people. During the Y Combinator batch, Paul gave Drew advice that shaped Dropbox's trajectory. He encouraged Drew to focus on making the core product work perfectly before adding features. He suggested strategies for viral growth, like giving users extra storage for referring friends. He helped Drew think about hiring, about how to find and attract talented engineers when Dropbox was still tiny. Most importantly, he validated Drew's belief that file syncing was a big opportunity worth pursuing, even though many investors thought it was a commodity feature that operating systems would build in. Dropbox grew rapidly after Y Combinator. By 2010, it had over 10 million users. By 2015, over 500 million users. By 2025, it was a public company worth billions. Drew credited Y Combinator with helping Dropbox in crucial ways during its earliest, most vulnerable stage. The small investment let him work full-time on Dropbox. Paul's advice helped him avoid common mistakes. Demo Day gave him access to investors who funded Dropbox growth. Airbnb came through Y Combinator in winter 2009. The founders, Brian Chesky, Joe Gebbia, and Nathan Blekeksik, had an idea that seemed crazy to most people. Let strangers rent out rooms or apartments in their homes to other strangers. Who would want to stay in a stranger's home instead of a hotel? Who would trust random people in their homes? The idea seemed dangerous and niche. Most investors passed. Airbnb had struggled to raise money before Y Combinator. But Paul saw something others missed. He saw that Brian and Joe were determined and resourceful. They had funded Airbnb by creating and selling cereal boxes during the 2008 presidential election, Obama O's and Cap N McCain's, making $30,000. This showed hustle and creativity. He also saw that their idea addressed a real problem. Hotels were expensive and impersonal. Many people had extra space they could rent. If you could solve the trust and safety problems, letting people rent from each other could work. Paul gave Airbnb advice that proved crucial. He told them to go to New York, where they had the most users, and meet customers in person. Understand what they needed. Help them succeed. Figure out what worked. This advice, to do things that did not scale, became central to how Airbnb grew. Brian and Joe spent weeks in New York meeting hosts, helping them take better photos of their apartments, understanding what made listings successful. This hands-on learning shaped how Airbnb built its product and marketplace. Paul also helped Airbnb think about their pitch. Initially, they described Airbnb as a way to book rooms from people rather than hotels. Paul suggested they focus on the experience, on belonging anywhere, on living like a local rather than a tourist. This reframing made Airbnb's value clearer and more compelling. It positioned Airbnb not as a cheaper hotel alternative but as a different, better way to travel. Airbnb struggled for years after Y Combinator. Growth was slow. Fundraising was difficult. Many investors still thought the idea was crazy. But Brian, Joe, and Nathan persisted, constantly improving the product, gradually building the marketplace. By 2011, Airbnb was starting to work. By 2015, it was one of the most valuable startups in the world. By 2025, it was a public company worth over $100 billion, having transformed how people traveled and thought about accommodation. Stripe came through Y Combinator in summer 2010. The founders, Patrick and John Collison, were brothers from Ireland who saw that accepting payments online was unnecessarily difficult. Existing payment processors required complicated paperwork, long approval processes, and clunky integration. Patrick and John thought they could make it simple. They wanted developers to be able to add payment processing to their websites with just a few lines of code. Paul saw that Stripe addressed a real problem. He had experienced the pain of payment processing when building ViaWeb. It was hard and took weeks to set up. If Patrick and John could make it easy, many developers would use it. He also saw that the Collison brothers were exceptionally smart and thoughtful. They understood the technical challenges. They understood the regulatory complexities. They were determined to build something that actually worked well. During the Y Combinator batch, Paul encouraged Stripe to focus relentlessly on developer experience. Make the API beautiful. Make the documentation clear. Make integration trivially easy. If developers loved using Stripe, they would choose it over alternatives even if other factors were equal. This focus on developer experience became central to Stripe's success. Developers did love Stripe's API. They recommended it to others. Stripe grew through word of mouth among developers. Paul also helped Stripe think about their long-term vision. They were not just building a payment processor. They were building infrastructure for internet commerce. As more business moved online, as more companies were built as software, they would all need payment processing. Stripe could become the financial infrastructure for the internet economy. This vision helped Stripe attract exceptional employees and investors who wanted to work on something ambitious. Stripe grew steadily after Y Combinator, adding more payment methods, expanding internationally, building additional services for businesses. By 2025, Stripe processed hundreds of billions of dollars annually and was valued at nearly $100 billion. It had become critical infrastructure for internet commerce, powering payments for millions of businesses. The Collison brothers credited Y Combinator with helping them in the earliest days when the vision was clear but the execution was unproven. These companies, Dropbox, Airbnb, Stripe, and hundreds of others, validated Y Combinator's approach. They showed that funding companies extremely early, giving them small amounts of capital and advice rather than large investments and heavy involvement, could lead to exceptional outcomes. They showed that many great founders were outside traditional networks, that they could be found through open applications rather than warm introductions. They showed that systematic advice and principles applied across many companies. But they also showed something about Paul's specific contributions. His advice was valuable not because it was secret or technical, but because it was clear and focused on what mattered. Do things that don't scale. Talk to users. Build something people want. Make something so good that people tell their friends. These principles seem obvious in retrospect, but founders building companies were constantly tempted to do other things, to focus on publicity or fundraising or hiring before getting the product right. Paul's advice kept them focused on what mattered. Legacy and contemporary impact. Current state as of 2025. Paul Graham is now 60 years old. He lives in England with his wife Jessica Livingston and their children. He continues writing essays that are widely read. He continues advising founders, though more selectively than during the Y Combinator years. He continues angel investing in early-stage companies that interest him. But his focus has shifted from building organizations to exploring ideas, from direct involvement in startups to thinking about broader questions. His influence remains significant even though he stepped back from running Y Combinator over a decade ago. His essays are still read by hundreds of thousands of people. His frameworks for thinking about startups, about making things people want, about doing things that don't scale, about growth as the defining characteristic of startups, have become standard wisdom in the technology industry. Founders still cite his advice. Investors still use his principles. Y Combinator still operates largely on the model he created. Paul's personal wealth is substantial, though he has never disclosed exact figures. His stake in Y Combinator companies, plus his angel investments and the money from selling ViaWeb, likely puts his net worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But wealth has never been his primary motivation. He has lived relatively modestly, focusing on work that interests him rather than maximizing income. His lifestyle reflects his stated values. Independence and time to work on interesting problems matter more than status or luxury. His reputation is mixed. Among founders and people in technology, he is widely respected. His essays are considered insightful. His advice is valued. His role in creating Y Combinator and helping thousands of founders is appreciated. But he also has critics. Some think his essays express conventional Silicon Valley ideology, emphasizing individual achievement and market solutions while downplaying systemic problems and inequality. Some think his contrarian positions on topics like political correctness reflect privilege and insensitivity. Some think Y Combinator has become too focused on maximizing returns rather than helping founders. Paul seems unconcerned with these criticisms. He writes what he thinks is true regardless of whether it is popular. He makes investments based on his judgment regardless of what others think. He lives where he wants and works on what interests him. This independence has been consistent throughout his life. He has always valued thinking clearly and acting on his own judgment more than fitting in or being liked. Investment philosophy crystallized. After decades of experience building companies, investing in startups, and advising founders, Paul's investment philosophy can be distilled into several core principles. These principles are not secret or complex. They are simple ideas that are difficult to execute consistently. Principle 1. Bet on exceptional founders, not ideas. Ideas change. Markets shift. Products evolve. But founders' capabilities and determination are relatively stable. Paul learned that the best predictor of startup success was not the initial idea but the founder's ability to figure things out, to adapt when things didn't work, to persist through difficulties, to attract talented people to join them. He looked for founders who were smart, determined, and flexible. Intelligence to understand problems deeply. Determination to keep going when things were hard. Flexibility to change approaches when evidence suggested they were wrong. This principle emerged from watching thousands of startups. The ones that succeeded usually ended up doing something different from their initial idea. They pivoted based on what they learned from users and markets. But the successful founders shared common traits. They were obsessed with their problem. They moved fast and learned quickly. They could convince talented people to join them. They made good decisions with incomplete information. These traits predicted success better than the specific idea they were working on. The application was to focus on evaluating founders rather than spending excessive time analyzing markets or competitive dynamics. If the founders were exceptional, they would figure out how to make their idea work or would pivot to something better. If the founders were mediocre, even a good idea would likely fail. Principle 2. Look for what conventional wisdom misses. The best opportunities are things that seem unpromising to most people but are actually valuable. If an opportunity is obviously good, it will be crowded with competition and expensive to pursue. The best returns come from seeing opportunities that others miss or dismiss. This requires questioning conventional wisdom and being willing to back ideas that seem weird or unlikely to most investors. Paul saw this pattern repeatedly. ViaWeb seemed unpromising to most people. Why would businesses run critical software on someone else's servers? Why Combinator seemed unpromising? How could tiny investments in very early companies generate good returns? Airbnb seemed unpromising. Who would stay in strangers' homes? In each case, conventional wisdom was wrong because it was based on outdated assumptions or failure to see how things would evolve. The application was to actively look for opportunities where you disagreed with consensus, where you saw something others missed. This required thinking independently and being willing to be wrong publicly. Most of these contrarian bets would fail. But the ones that worked would generate exceptional returns because you got in early when prices were low and competition was minimal. Principle 3. Growth is the essential characteristic. What distinguishes a startup from other kinds of businesses is growth rate. A successful startup grows rapidly, typically 10% per week or more in its early stages. A small business might be profitable but grow slowly. A startup sacrifices short-term profitability for rapid growth. This growth is what makes startups valuable and what attracts investment. Paul crystallized this idea in his essay, Startup Equals Growth. He argued that if you are not growing fast, you are not really a startup, you are just a business. Growth solves many problems. It attracts employees who want to work on something important. It attracts investors who see momentum. It creates opportunities to learn and iterate quickly. Conversely, lack of growth reveals problems. If you build something and it does not grow fast, either you built the wrong thing or you are reaching the wrong market. The application was to focus ruthlessly on growth in the early stages. Measure week-over-week growth. Understand what drives it. Do more of what works. If growth is slow, figure out why and fix it. Don't get distracted by things that don't drive growth: press coverage, speaking opportunities, office space. Focus on growth above all else in the early stages. Principle 4. Do things that don't scale. In the early stages, startups should do things manually and inefficiently if that helps them understand users and build something people want. Don't try to automate or scale prematurely. Instead, do whatever it takes to delight early users, even if it is labor-intensive and cannot continue long-term. These unscalable efforts teach you what users actually need and what makes them happy. This principle came from watching successful startups. Airbnb succeeded partly because Brian and Joe visited hosts in person, helped them photograph their apartments, taught them how to be good hosts. This did not scale, they could not visit every host. But it taught them what made hosts successful, and they built those lessons into the product. Stripe succeeded partly because Patrick and John personally helped early customers integrate Stripe, sometimes writing code for them. Again, unscalable, but it taught them how to make integration easy. The application was to resist the temptation to build scalable systems before you understood what users needed. Instead, interact with users directly and manually. Provide white glove service. Learn everything you can. Only after you deeply understand what users need should you start building scalable systems. Many startups failed because they built scalable systems for the wrong thing. Better to do the right thing unscalably than the wrong thing at scale. Principle 5. Make something people want. This is the most fundamental principle, but also the most frequently violated. Startups fail primarily because they build things nobody wants. They build clever solutions to non-problems. They build features that seem cool but don't actually help users. They build for hypothetical users they imagine rather than real users they talk to. The way to succeed is simple but hard. Build something that solves a real problem for real people, and make it so good that people tell their friends. Paul emphasized this constantly at Y Combinator. Talk to users. Understand their problems. Build something that solves those problems. Get it into users' hands quickly. See if they actually use it and find it valuable. If they don't, figure out why and fix it. If they do, understand what they love about it and amplify that. Don't build in a vacuum. Don't assume you know what users want. Listen to them and watch what they actually do. The application was to ruthlessly prioritize talking to users and iterating based on what you learn. Spend less time on pitches and fundraising and publicity. Spend more time understanding users and building for them. Measure success not by vanity metrics like press mentions but by real metrics like active users and retention. If users keep coming back and telling their friends, you are building something people want. If not, you need to change something fundamental. Principle 6. Default alive, not default dead. Startups should manage their money so they can survive indefinitely on their current resources or reach profitability before running out. Being default alive means you will survive without raising more money. Being default dead means you will run out of money before reaching profitability or key milestones that let you raise more. Default alive gives you control and options. Default dead makes you desperate and forces you to raise money on bad terms or shut down. This principle came from watching startups fail not because their ideas were bad but because they ran out of money at the wrong time. They raised money during boom times, spent aggressively, then could not raise again when markets turned. If they had been more frugal, they would have survived and eventually succeeded. Being default alive meant they controlled their destiny. Being default dead meant investors and markets controlled their fate. The application was to be frugal, to spend only on things that directly drove growth or built the product, to maintain enough runway to reach profitability or clear milestones. This was not about being cheap. It was about maintaining control. If you were default alive, you could take risks and be patient. If you were default dead, every decision was made under pressure, and you were vulnerable to any shock or setback. Looking back across Paul's full career, the sources of his exceptional impact become clear. They were not single factors but combinations of capabilities and circumstances that created unique advantages. The first source was synthetic thinking, the ability to connect ideas across domains. Paul understood art and programming, philosophy and business, theory and practice. This let him see patterns that specialists missed, apply frameworks from one domain to problems in another, and understand startups from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Most people in technology were narrow specialists. Paul was a generalist who could think across boundaries. The second source was clarity of thought. Paul could see through complexity and confusion to underlying principles. This came from training in philosophy, experience in programming, and personality that valued truth over consensus. When everyone else was confused, Paul could often identify what really mattered and what was distraction. This clarity let him give advice that cut to the core of problems and helped founders make better decisions. The third source was taste. Paul had an intuitive sense of quality, whether in code, writing, ideas, or founders. This came from experience with art, from reading widely, from building things himself. He could distinguish between work that was technically competent and work that was actually great. This taste let him evaluate opportunities that analysis alone could not capture. The fourth source was independence. Paul thought for himself and did not care much what others thought. This let him make contrarian bets, question conventional wisdom, and pursue ideas that seemed strange to most people. Many of his best insights came from asking why everyone believed something and realizing the belief was wrong. This independence was partly temperament, partly philosophy, and partly the result of being an outsider who never quite fit in. The fifth source was communication ability. Paul could explain complex ideas clearly. His essays spread widely because they articulated things people felt but could not express. This communication ability gave him influence far beyond his direct interactions. People who never met him were influenced by his ideas through his writing. This leverage multiplied his impact. The sixth source was network effects built over decades. Paul knew smart, capable people who knew other smart, capable people. His reputation meant that exceptional founders wanted him involved in their companies. His credibility meant that when he said something, people paid attention. These network effects compounded over time, creating advantages that were hard for others to replicate. The seventh source was timing. Paul came of age just as personal computers and then the internet were creating unprecedented opportunities. He was young enough to adapt to new technologies but old enough to have developed serious capabilities when opportunities emerged. He experienced ViaWeb during the first dot-com boom, which gave him credibility. He started Y Combinator just as Web 2.0 was beginning, which was perfect timing for an early-stage investor. These sources combined in ways that were more than additive. Paul's clarity made his writing more effective. His synthetic thinking informed his taste. His independence let him act on his judgment. His network effects amplified his influence. The combination created capabilities that very few people had. But there was also luck. Paul was fortunate to grow up in a family that valued education and gave him freedom to explore interests. He was fortunate to attend good universities where he met talented people. He was fortunate to start ViaWeb at exactly the right moment. He was fortunate that Y Combinator's timing was perfect. Skill mattered enormously, but so did circumstance and chance. Paul's most significant impact was on how early-stage startups are funded and built. Before Y Combinator, early-stage investing was done primarily by angel investors who invested individually based on personal networks, or by venture capitalists who waited until companies had already achieved significant traction. Y Combinator created a new model, systematic, batch-based investment in very early companies, combined with advice and community that helped founders succeed. This model changed the startup ecosystem in several ways. It made startup funding more accessible. Anyone could apply to Y Combinator regardless of connections or credentials. This opened opportunities to founders who would have been excluded from traditional networks. It made starting a company less risky. The small investment meant founders did not have to give up much equity or control. The 3-month program gave them focused time to learn and build. It created community among founders who could help each other. The Y Combinator model also influenced how other investors operated. Many accelerators were created copying aspects of Y Combinator's approach. Venture capitalists started investing earlier, creating seed funds to compete with accelerators. Angel investors became more systematic, creating syndicates and groups rather than investing individually. The entire early-stage ecosystem shifted toward more, smaller, earlier investments. Paul's essays also had significant impact. His writing articulated principles and frameworks that became standard ways of thinking about startups. The idea that startups are defined by growth. The principle of doing things that don't scale. The importance of making something people want. The distinction between default alive and default dead. These ideas shaped how founders thought about building companies and how investors thought about evaluating them. His influence extended beyond startups to broader thinking about technology and business. His essays on topics like design, programming languages, wealth creation, and independent thinking were read by hundreds of thousands of people. They influenced how people thought about these topics. They demonstrated that clear thinking and writing could have substantial impact. They showed that you did not need academic credentials or institutional positions to contribute important ideas. Y Combinator companies created enormous economic value. By 2025, Y Combinator had funded over 4,000 companies worth over $300 billion combined. These companies employed hundreds of thousands of people. They provided products and services used by billions of people globally. They created wealth for founders, employees, and investors. This value creation was substantial and real. But the impact was also uneven and created concerns. Y Combinator companies contributed to winner-take-all dynamics in many industries. Airbnb disrupted the hotel industry and short-term rental markets. Uber and Lyft transformed transportation but created challenges for taxi drivers and questions about worker classification. Coinbase and other crypto companies enabled new financial technologies but also facilitated speculation and fraud. DoorDash and Instacart created convenience for consumers but questions about sustainability and worker treatment. These impacts reflect broader questions about technology and capitalism. Does innovation primarily create or redistribute wealth? Do technology companies make society better or just make founders and investors rich? What obligations do companies have to workers, communities, and society beyond maximizing shareholder value? Paul engaged with these questions in his essays, generally arguing that wealth creation through building things people want is positive and that concerns about inequality should focus on opportunities and mobility rather than outcomes. Critics argued that this perspective reflected Silicon Valley ideology and downplayed legitimate concerns about power, inequality, and social responsibility. They argued that Paul's emphasis on individual achievement and market solutions ignored systemic factors and structural barriers. They argued that Y Combinator and the companies it funded contributed to inequality, displacement, and social problems. These criticisms had merit, though Paul's defenders argued that creating opportunities and building valuable products was ultimately beneficial even if imperfect. Paul's ideas remain relevant in 2025, though the context has changed. The technology industry has matured. Startups are more professionalized. Capital is more abundant. Competition is more intense. The opportunities and challenges facing founders today are different from those in 2005 when Y Combinator started. Some of Paul's principles remain applicable. The importance of making something people want. The value of talking to users and iterating quickly. The need for determination and flexibility. The advantage of thinking independently. These principles reflect fundamental aspects of building companies that transcend specific eras. Other aspects have changed. The barrier to starting a company is lower now. Cloud infrastructure is cheap and easy. Development tools are powerful. Distribution through app stores and social media is accessible. This means more people can start companies, which increases competition. It also means that differentiation matters more. You cannot succeed just by building a working product. You need to build something exceptional that stands out in a crowded market. The role of AI and automation is transforming software and startups in ways that were not relevant when Paul started writing. These technologies create new opportunities but also raise questions about what kinds of work humans will do and how value will be created and distributed. Paul has written about AI, generally optimistic about its potential but thoughtful about challenges. His perspective emphasizes that technology creates opportunities for those who adapt and learn to use new tools effectively. The questions Paul explored, how to do great work, how to think clearly, how to build things people want, how to live well, remain important regardless of technological changes. His essays provide frameworks for thinking about these questions that are useful even as specific details change. The core insights, about the importance of following your curiosity, about questioning conventional wisdom, about focusing on what matters, continue to resonate. Investment lessons. Lesson 1: Ideas are not the bottleneck. Most people think the hard part of building a startup is having a good idea. They worry about whether their idea is novel enough, whether someone else will steal it, whether it is the billion-dollar idea. But Paul learned that ideas are not the bottleneck. Execution is the bottleneck. Many people can have good ideas. Very few can execute well enough to turn those ideas into valuable companies. This insight came from watching thousands of startups. The successful ones usually did not start with the best ideas. They started with decent ideas and exceptional founders. Reddit was not the first link sharing site. Dropbox was not the first file syncing tool. Airbnb was not the first home sharing platform. But the founders executed better than competitors. They built better products, understood users more deeply, made better decisions, and persisted through difficulties. The mechanism is that execution requires many capabilities: technical skill, user understanding, judgment, determination. Ideas require only imagination. Since many people have imagination but fewer have the full set of execution capabilities, execution is the scarce resource. This is why investors focus on founders rather than ideas. Exceptional founders can figure out good ideas or pivot to better ones. Mediocre founders will fail even with good ideas. The application is to worry less about whether your idea is perfect and more about whether you can execute well. Don't be secretive about your idea. Instead, talk to potential users, get feedback, iterate. Don't wait for the perfect idea. Start with something reasonable and improve it through execution. Focus on building capabilities, technical skills, user understanding, decision-making ability. These matter more than the initial idea. The psychology of why this is hard to follow is that ideas are emotionally satisfying. Coming up with a clever idea feels like progress. Executing is hard, uncertain, and often boring. People naturally gravitate toward ideation and away from execution. But success requires flipping this. Treat ideas as cheap and execution as precious. Spend more time building and less time thinking about what to build. Lesson 2. Talk to users. Most startups fail because they build things nobody wants. The way to avoid this failure mode is simple: talk to users constantly. Understand their problems. Watch how they use your product. Listen to their complaints and confusions. Build what they need, not what you think they need. Iteration based on user feedback is how you converge on product market fit. This lesson came from Paul's own experience and from watching successful Y Combinator companies. Airbnb figured out their product by meeting hosts in person. Stripe built their API by helping early customers integrate personally. Dropbox refined their product by watching how users actually used it. In each case, direct interaction with users revealed insights that no amount of theorizing would have produced. The mechanism is that founders have ideas about what users need, but these ideas are often wrong. Users have problems you did not anticipate. They use your product in unexpected ways. They care about features you thought were minor and ignore features you thought were important. The only way to discover this is through direct interaction. Users cannot always articulate what they need, but you can learn by watching what they do and listening to their frustrations. The boundaries are that sometimes users ask for things that seem important but are not actually what matters. Henry Ford's saying about customers wanting faster horses applies here. You need to understand the underlying problem users are trying to solve, not just implement every feature they request. You also need to distinguish between power users who want complexity and typical users who want simplicity. The skill is interpreting user feedback correctly, not just implementing every suggestion. The application today is to make talking to users a regular part of how you work, not something you do occasionally. Schedule user interviews weekly. Watch users interact with your product, whether in person or through recorded sessions. Read support tickets and complaints. Participate in customer-facing channels like chat or forums. Make user understanding central to how you make decisions. When deciding between features or approaches, ask which one better serves actual users you have talked to. Paul's most developed thinking about how to live well centers on doing great work. He wrote a long essay on this topic in 2019, exploring what it takes to do work that matters and that you are proud of. The core insight is that great work requires a combination of natural ability, hard work, and taste developed through practice and study. You need to find work you have some natural ability for. People vary in their talents. Some are naturally good at technical thinking. Some are good at understanding people. Some are good at seeing visual relationships. You need to find work that matches your natural strengths. This does not mean work that is easy, but work where you have enough aptitude that you can get good with practice. You also need to work that interests you enough that you will think about it obsessively. Great work requires years of focused effort. You will not sustain that effort unless you find the work intrinsically interesting. You need to care about it for its own sake, not just for external rewards like money or status. Paul described this as finding work that is fun in the sense that it engages you fully. Finally, you need to develop taste, the ability to distinguish between work that is actually good and work that just looks impressive. This comes through study and practice. You study examples of great work in your field. You try to understand what makes them great. You practice making things yourself and comparing them to the best examples. Gradually, you develop judgment about quality that guides your own work. The lesson is that great work is not primarily about intelligence or credentials. Many smart people with impressive degrees do mediocre work. Great work comes from finding the intersection of what you are good at, what you find interesting, and what matters. Then working at that intersection with dedication and constantly improving your judgment about quality. Paul's life exemplified independent thinking. He questioned conventional wisdom in domain after domain and was proven right often enough that people took his contrarian ideas seriously. But independent thinking is not just about disagreeing with consensus. It is about actively seeking truth regardless of what others think. Independent thinking requires both intellectual courage and intellectual humility. Courage to question beliefs that everyone else accepts, to pursue ideas that seem weird, to risk being wrong publicly. Humility to change your mind when evidence suggests you were wrong, to admit you do not know rather than pretend certainty, to learn from others even when they lack credentials. The hardest part of independent thinking is not the thinking itself but the social pressure to conform. Humans are social creatures. We want to fit in, to be liked, to have our beliefs validated by others. Going against consensus feels uncomfortable. It risks ridicule or exclusion. Most people cannot tolerate this discomfort, so they conform even when they suspect the consensus is wrong. Paul managed this discomfort partly through temperament. He seemed naturally less concerned with social approval than most people. But also through philosophy. He believed deeply that truth mattered more than conformity, that figuring out what was actually true was more important than fitting in. This belief gave him strength to tolerate social discomfort when his views diverged from consensus. The lesson is that if you want to do original work, you must develop tolerance for going against consensus. You must cultivate the ability to think independently while remaining open to being wrong. You must care more about truth than about being liked. This is psychologically difficult, but it is necessary for making important contributions. Most important truths start out looking wrong to most people. Paul became wealthy through ViaWeb and Y Combinator, but wealth was never his primary goal. He wanted to build things that mattered, to understand how things worked, to have freedom to work on what interested him. Money was instrumental, it provided freedom and security, but it was not the end goal. This perspective came partly from his background. He grew up middle class, comfortable but not wealthy. He saw that beyond a certain level of material comfort, more money did not make people happier. He also saw that chasing money often led people to do work they did not care about, to make compromises they regretted, to sacrifice what actually mattered for what seemed important. The lesson Paul articulated was that you should aim to be default alive financially but not optimize for maximum wealth. Have enough money that you are not worried about bills, that you can focus on work rather than survival. Have enough savings that you can take risks, try things that might fail, not be desperate. But beyond that, optimize for interesting work and learning rather than maximum income. This is psychologically difficult because wealth is a visible scorecard. It is easy to compare yourself to others and feel like you should be making more money. It is easy to think that if you just made more money, you would be happier or more respected. But Paul observed that the happiest and most accomplished people were usually those who found work they loved and did it well, not those who optimized purely for money. Paul's success came partly through relationships. Robert Morris as co-founder of Viaweb and Y Combinator. Jessica Livingston as co-founder of Y Combinator and life partner. Trevor Blackwell as co-founder of Y Combinator. The thousands of founders Paul advised who connected him to other founders. The readers of his essays who spread his ideas. None of his achievements happened in isolation. But Paul's approach to relationships was somewhat unusual. He was not naturally social. He was awkward at small talk and parties. He preferred deep conversations with a few people over shallow interactions with many. He valued authenticity over politeness. He maintained relationships with people he learned from and enjoyed, not people who were useful for networking. This selective approach worked for Paul because the relationships he did cultivate were genuine and deep. The people he worked with trusted him because he was honest and thoughtful. They wanted to help him because he had helped them. He built a reputation as someone who was smart and fair, which made people want to work with him. Quality of relationships mattered more than quantity. The lesson is that relationships should be based on genuine connection and mutual value, not on networking or status seeking. Cultivate relationships with people you learn from, people who make you better, people you enjoy spending time with. Help them generously without expectation of return. Over time, these relationships compound in value. They create opportunities, support during difficulties, and meaning beyond professional success. Paul Graham's story reveals something important about how exceptional achievement works. It is rarely about single factors like intelligence or hard work. It is about combining multiple capabilities in unique ways, then applying those capabilities to important problems at the right time. Paul combined art and programming, philosophy and business, theory and practice. He developed clarity of thought, taste, and independence. He built credibility and networks over decades. He positioned himself to see opportunities that others missed. This is the story of Paul Graham.